Okay, let's unpack this. We have an intensely focused deep dive today, and it's built entirely on, well, a really challenging stack of sources detailing various post-war planning efforts for Gaza.
Yeah, it's not your standard geopolitical commentary, is it? We're looking at specific financial blueprints, detailed infrastructure proposals.
And critically, documents outlining these, let's just say, highly suspicious, high-level strategic agendas. It's quite a mix.
Right, and that tension, between the immediate conflict and this long-term planning, that's really the core of what we're diving into today.
So our mission, if you will, is to explore this profound suspicion that seems embedded in the source material.
The suspicion that underlying economic development, these high-level corporate interests, and maybe even broader Western strategic agendas are already somehow influencing the conflict and definitely shaping the reconstruction plans that are being floated.
And the sources keep circling back to one central, pretty startling focus, don't they?
They do. It's this perceived plan to basically transform the Gaza coastline into an immense, incredibly lucrative asset.
Which, according to these documents, seems to inevitably require the permanent relocation or displacement of a really significant chunk of the population.
Yeah, the analysis actually uses some pretty stark language, referencing things like clearing the squatters so that, captains of industry can move in and develop this prime coastal area.
So we're synthesizing a lot here. Academic critiques of what the sources call disaster capitalism.
Right, alongside cold, hard financial projections, and then these documents outlining these, well, vast, sometimes shadowy global power structures. It's tricky territory.
Absolutely. It demands we stick strictly to what the sources present, remain impartial, and really focus on the so what behind these, frankly, staggering figures and claims.
Okay, so to understand the governance models being talked about, we probably need to start with the framework the sources themselves use, this idea of disaster capitalism.
Right. The term is used to describe a pretty specific mechanism, isn't it, for post-conflict exploitation.
Exactly. It's not just about reconstruction aid flowing in. It's described as a strategy where externally imposed governance and new economic arrangements are kind of rushed into place during the chaos right after a conflict.
And the goal?
The goal, according to this framework, is to allow for the appropriation of resources, massive profiteering by outside entities, often using the crisis itself to sideline local control, and maybe even set up long-term debt structures.
And the sources don't present this as theoretical. They draw some very pointed historical parallels. Afghanistan and Iraq come up repeatedly.
Yeah, they look closely at Afghanistan post-2001 and Iraq post-2003. And the playbook, as laid out in the analysis, looks disturbingly consistent.
How so?
Well, first, you often see rapid regime change or destabilization, then prolonged counterinsurgency operations. And following that, the installation of, let's say, pro-Western compliant elites.
Elites who might not actually have much power over the country's economic path.
Precisely. But the key mechanism, the analysis stresses, is bypassing local sovereignty, especially when it comes to the money, the reconstruction funds.
Okay, how did that work in those examples like Afghanistan?
In Afghanistan, the sources document how the whole institutional framework was basically designed to prevent any real Afghan control over the funding. It's a pretty shocking figure they cite.
Which as?
Fully two-thirds of all the aid went directly from the international donors, the US, EU, World Bank, straight to subcontractors they chose, often Western corporations, NGOs.
So the Afghan government itself was largely cut out of the loop on where its own reconstruction money was going.
That's what the sources indicate. No meaningful control over those funds. It effectively creates this kind of external economic control through, massive debt and development contracts that primarily benefit foreign interests.
That's a terrifying clarification. The recovery resources themselves become tools for long-term control. So if that's the pattern identified in the past, the big question is, does this systematic exclusion of Palestinian voices seem to be baked into the current post-war plans for Gaza that these sources detail?
Well, that's pretty much the core finding of the analysis for this first section. The short answer is yes. None of the major post-war authorities proposed in these documents seem to suggest any meaningful role for existing Palestinian institutions or, established civil society groups.
The structure itself guarantees external control or supervision from day one.
That's the argument presented. It seems designed that way.
Okay. Give us the names. What are these proposed authorities actually called? because it tells you a lot about who the sources think will be holding the reins.
We looked at 3 main proposals in the source documents, and interestingly, they all kind of end up in the same place, external control, just with different branding, you could say.
Okay.
So Israel's Gaza 2035 plan mentions a body called the Gaza Rehabilitation Authority. Then you have the Jens of Vandenberg Coalition, which is a key American strategic think tank effort. They propose an international trust for Gaza relief and reconstruction.
An international trust. Okay.
And meanwhile, the RAND Corporation, which ran its own scenarios, suggests a multinational coalition authority.
Gaza Rehabilitation Authority, International Trust, Multinational Coalition Authority. Yeah, these aren't subtle, are they? They all sound like outside bodies.
Exactly. Comprised of donors, international bureaucrats, maybe military strategists. Explicitly designed, it seems, to manage the funds and the reality on the ground, effectively freezing out local sovereignty.
And the most blatant part, according to the analysis, is who actually gets consulted.
That's where it gets really explicit. The sources emphasize that consultation is reserved only for Palestinians who are, and this is a direct quote from the analysis, vetted and approved by Israel and the United States.
Vetted and approved. So ensuring only compliant voices get a seat at the table, if they even get that.
That's the implication. The sources conclude that denying local populations control over governing and financing their own reconstruction isn't some kind of oversight. It's framed as the essential first step to implement this disaster capitalism model.
Okay, so if external control through disaster capitalism is the mechanism, we have to ask, what's the prize? Why go to all this trouble?
And that brings us squarely into Section 2 and the immense financial motivation detailed in these documents. This is where the numbers stop being academic and just become, frankly, astonishing.
Right, we're now looking at documents detailing what's sometimes called the Gaza Riviera concept or the Gaza 2035 plan.
And in these models, Gaza isn't really analyzed as a humanitarian crisis to be solved or even a demographic issue. It's explicitly framed as a highly valuable coastal asset, just waiting for financial exploitation.
Let's talk scale then, because the valuation presented is, well, it's staggering.
It is. By year 10 of the plan, the calculated asset valuation of Gaza is projected to be around $324 billion.
$324 billion.
Yeah, $324 billion. Just to put that in perspective for you, our listener, that's roughly the current GDP of, say, Finland or Singapore.
Wow.
And that projection represents something like an 11-fold growth, almost 1,100% compared to Gaza's pre-war GDP levels. It's describing a total transformation, a kind of hyper-leveraged coastal mega project.
Okay, how? How do they project getting to that kind of number? Where does the growth come from?
Well, the plan projects pumping in about $133 billion in outside investment over that first decade.
$133 billion in investment.
With the intention of generating around $185 billion in revenue during that same period. These are colossal figures, multinational corporate scale, way beyond any normal aid or reconstruction budget.
Yeah, this isn't rebuilding homes and basic infrastructure, is it? This sounds like building a completely new, enormous financial gateway.
That's exactly the picture painted. Let's break down where that massive investment goes, because the categories themselves tell a story. It's clearly focused on transforming the coastline and setting up major logistical hubs, things that are essential for global trade, not just, local Palestinian needs.
Like what, specifically?
The anchor investment, the really big one, is the deep port construction. That needs an upfront investment of somewhere between $1.3 billion and $1.9 billion.
A deep water port.
Yes. And this port is projected to bring in annual revenues of $700 million to $850 million once it's up and running.
Okay.
And crucially, the sources explicitly mention the need for this Gaza port to serve as a major hub for IMEC.
IMEC. The India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor.
Exactly. That project.
So a port project on that scale, plugging directly into IMEC, that immediately elevates Gaza's strategic importance from just a regional conflict zone to a potential node in global trade.
It puts it in a different league entirely. The sources compare its potential scale and function to major emerging global ports, like the ones being built in Shanxi, Peru, or Machilipatnam in India. It becomes a potentially irreplaceable asset in that trade corridor.
And a port like that needs more than just docks.
Absolutely. The plan includes a significant rail hub investment, too, roughly $3 billion allocated for high-speed rail and freight corridor capacity.
Again, huge numbers.
With an expected annual revenue from that rail capacity of about $500 million. The whole financial model just assumes Gaza rapidly becomes this global logistics gateway, not just, a place where aid comes in.
Okay, so port and rail, that's the logistics backbone.
Yeah.
What about the coastal area itself, the actual Riviera part? How does that get developed to justify that $324 billion valuation?
Well, that's where the tourism and high-value development comes in. The plan forecasts a massive tourism industry,
How massive?
projecting annual revenues of around $3 billion by year 10. And the sources note, just for comparison, that this level of revenue would be about 30% larger than Oman's entire tourism industry right now.
$3 billion a year in tourism revenue in Gaza. How? What gets built?
To make that happen, the financial blueprints specify the construction of 30 to 40 luxury hotels right along that prime coastal land.
30 to 40 luxury hotels.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that implies, well, it implies completely clearing and overhauling the existing urban fabric in the most desirable beachfront areas, doesn't it?
It certainly suggests a radical transformation of the coastline, and it's not just tourism. What about other high-value industries?
Yeah, what else is planned besides hotels?
The plan also targets large investments in advanced manufacturing. They model it after facilities like the TSMC chip plant in Arizona or the Nevada Tesla Gigafactory. A huge scale.
So potentially $6 to $12 billion just in construction costs for manufacturing.
That's the range mentioned, yeah.
Yeah.
With projections of maybe up to $10 billion in annual revenue from manufacturing alone eventually. Plus, hyperscale data centers are also listed as a key upfront investment, valued somewhere between $500 million and $1.5 billion.
So the vision is absolutely corporate, high-tech, built on this prime coastal real estate.
Unequivocally. That's the picture painted in these financial documents.
Okay, this analysis seems to firmly establish that this looks like a commercially driven venture, potentially a land grab, targeting a prime coastal area, which isn't like typical humanitarian recovery at all.
But in the slightest.
And this brings us right back to that really uncomfortable element. The population control, the displacement, that seems woven into these financial plans. How is that legally supposed to work?
Well, this is addressed quite directly in the documents through the proposed legal and administrative structure. Specifically, what's called the Business Operating Trust, or BOT, approach, particularly mentioned in the U.S. plan analysis.
A BOT, what is that exactly?
It's basically a financial and legal structure. It allows a private entity, like a consortium of investors, to fund, build, operate, and maintain a public utility or a big infrastructure project for a fixed period.
Okay, and how is it applied here?
In this specific plan for Gaza, the BOT would establish a civil administration government. But this administration would be controlled by the foreign investors. How? Via a 50-year lease arrangement.
50 years. A 50-year lease. That's half a century of external administrative and economic control.
That's what the documents outline.
And how does that lease legally handle Palestinian sovereignty? Or does it?
Well, according to the analysis, the mechanism is designed precisely for long-term external financial control and, crucially, risk mitigation for the investors. Palestinian sovereignty. It's literally deferred. It only gets addressed after this 5-decade lease expires.
So for 50 years, all the major decisions, land use, infrastructure, maybe even taxation and law enforcement within these corporate zones would be dictated by this BOT, controlled by the foreign investors.
That's what the structure implies. It's described in the analysis almost as financial colonization, but done via contract.
And the population displacement. It's not just a potential side effect, is it? The sources say it's actually quantified in the financial model as a cost-benefit item.
Yes, chillingly it is. It's framed as relocation support, but it's costed out. The documents quantify the desired permanent relocation of approximately 90,000 families.
90,000 families.
Yeah.
How many people is that estimated to be?
By year 10, that's estimated to be around 500,000 people. 500,000 people permanently relocated.
And what's the support package?
Each family identified for relocation would receive a package worth about $55,000, plus subsidized rent for 4 years outside of Gaza.
Okay, but what's truly disturbing is how the documents frame this. You said it's presented as economically efficient.
Exactly. That's the most chilling part. The financial blueprints actually calculate that there's an estimated saving of roughly $23,000 for every single Palestinian who relocates permanently outside Gaza compared to keeping them inside the development zone.
How does that calculation even work? Paying someone $55,000 to leave saves money. It sounds completely counterintuitive from a humanitarian perspective.
The logic presented in the documents breaks it down like this. It costs, say, $9,000 to support someone outside Gaza, but it saves $32,000 in costs inside Gaza for every person who relocates.
So the implication is that the cost of rebuilding their communities within these planned high-value zones, or maybe just dealing with them as residents within the asset area, is considered far higher than simply paying them to move out.
That's the cold calculation presented. The financial incentive to relocate people is therefore baked right into the plan's overall success metrics. It essentially budgets for clearing the squatters, as that earlier Stark phrase put it.
Okay, if you're going to enforce a 50-year foreign-controlled lease on a massive, potentially $324 billion coastal asset surrounded by a potentially hostile or displaced population, you're going to need a serious security framework.
Absolutely. And that apparatus is also meticulously detailed and costed in these plans.
What does it look like?
The projected security costs are significant. They explicitly include what they call fully burdened costs, meaning everything included for Western private security contractors.
PSCs, basically private military forces.
Essentially, yes. And also for third country nationals, TCNs, who are often used for support, logistics, technical roles, and alongside them, international peacekeepers.
And fully burdened means covering in their life support, housing, operational costs, everything.
Everything. It emphasizes the need for a necessary, sustained security apparatus, one required to enforce this long-term foreign control established by the 50-year lease and the corporate development, likely against potential local opposition.
So the financial plan itself recognizes you need a massive, non-local security presence just to secure the investment and the profits.
That's what the inclusion of these detailed costs strongly suggests.
Right. This analysis of the financial blueprints gives us a pretty clear, if disturbing, picture of the visible corporate motivation.
The profit motive, yeah.
But now we have to shift gears into the murkier world of high-level strategy and, frankly, deep suspicion. The source material that suggests these events might be influenced by powerful, often invisible hierarchies operating globally.
Yes, we move now to these highly suspicious documents that reference something called the Committee of 300.
And how is this committee described in these sources?
It's described as a kind of conspirators hierarchy, operating way beyond the reach of any single government, allegedly controlling everything from major corporations and banks to research institutions, like the Tavistock Institute in the UK is mentioned specifically.
And the goal attributed to this alleged group is, well, it's monumental.
Almost unbelievably so. The sources claim it's nothing less than pushing for a one world government, new world order, complete with a unified church, a unified monetary system.
And the aim is the utter destruction of all national identity and national pride, and global deindustrialization through zero-growth plans.
That's what these specific documents allege, yes.
Okay, but hang on. There seems to be a contradiction there. How can this committee supposedly push for global zero growth, yet the Gaza plan we just discussed projects this insane 11x growth?
That's a really important point. The sources attempt to explain this apparent dissonance. They argue that the zero-growth policy is actually intended only for the industrial base of established Western nations and any developing economies that might, compete with this global elite.
Ah, so it's selective deindustrialization.
That's the claim. Meanwhile, wealth consolidation and hypergrowth are reserved for the oligarchy's own key strategic assets, like potentially a brand new, centrally controlled Middle Eastern trade and tech hub built on the Gaza coast.
The documents also name specific, very well-known individuals as agents of influence for this structure, don't they?
They do. Henry Kissinger, for example, is prominently featured. He's identified in these sources as a key agent for the Royal Institute for International Affairs, RIA, a member of the Club of Rome, the Council on Foreign Relations, basically deeply embedded in this alleged network.
Described as instrumental in carrying out their strategic agenda?
Yes, and the claims about his influence go way beyond just normal diplomacy.
How so?
The sources make some pretty extreme claims. They allege he was directly involved in destabilizing nations and even threatening world leaders.
Such as?
Well, they make the very strong claim that he was behind the death of Aldo Moro, the Italian leader, threatening to eliminate him if Moro didn't abandon economic plans for Italy that supposedly threatened the established order.
Oh.
They also claim he threatened the late Ali Bhutto of Pakistan over Pakistan's nuclear program. And the documents even attribute the destabilization of the United States itself through three major draining wars, the Middle East, Korea, and Vietnam, partially to Kissinger's alleged role in service of the RIAA. painting him almost as an architect of controlled chaos necessary for consolidating power.
Okay, these are huge conspiratorial claims.
Yeah.
And again, we're reporting what's in these specific documents.
Absolutely. We have to keep stressing that. And how is this agenda supposedly enforced on a broader scale? Culturally, psychologically?
The sources talk about a sophisticated process of social engineering.
Right. Reportedly driven by institutions like the Tavistock Institute. The alleged goal is to steer society into what Zbigniew Brzezinski apparently called the technotronic era, a concept he supposedly copied from this Committee of 300's blueprint.
And this technotronic era is envisioned as what? A kind of dictatorship.
A subtle one, yeah. A system that relies on managing societal decline, oddly enough, to achieve control.
And the mechanism for that control is described as insidious, using manufactured amusement focus and spectator spectacles.
Yeah, like an opiate for an increasingly purposeless mass is the phrase used. It's framed as psychological warfare, aimed at manufacturing distraction and confusion to basically manage the population.
And this connects to how public opinion itself is supposedly shaped.
Directly. The sources allege that major polling companies Gallup, Yankelovich, Skelly, and White are named don't just measure public opinion, they actually determine what we see. They shape the perception based on policy directives handed down from this Committee of 300.
So the narrative we consume about any crisis, whether it's politics or war, might be, according to this view, predetermined to align with the hierarchy's goals. It's called public opinion making.
Yes, described as a tool used to both gauge public reaction and then immediately work to change it if needed.
And the ultimate goal of all this manipulation, according to these documents,
It's pretty dark. The alleged goal is to generate such extreme confusion, such maladaptive responses to crises that they create, that eventually the population becomes desperate. Desperate enough to welcome the sudden appearance of a strong leader, maybe even dictator, who promises to restore order and stability.
okay, that's why these highly suspicious documents are part of this analysis.
Mm-hmm.
They represent the absolute peak level of systemic distrust regarding Western strategic motives.
Exactly. And to bring this back to the money, the financial oligarchy we discussed earlier, the sources really emphasize the involvement of the British aristocracy and that RIIA network.
How does that financial connection work?
It's presented as vital. The sources assert that the real locus of power is centered in a British oligarchy that controls global finance and intelligence ops. They cite the immense power of companies like the Eagle Star Group.
Eagle Star.
Yeah, described as a major front for British intelligence, MI6, and allegedly controlled directly by the Queen of England's family. This vast, often hidden wealth is cited as a key part of the puzzle. It funds these alleged black operations against opponents of committee policies, and it allows the financial sector, they claim, to dictate geopolitical outcomes.
So this high-level suspicion forces us to view those Gaza development plans, the $324 billion, the 50-year lease, not just as maybe greedy corporate ventures,
But potentially as a key strategic move in a much, much larger game. A game of global consolidation, wealth aggregation, and long-term control, orchestrated from the shadows. Again, we're relaying the claims in the source material impartially.
Indeed. It frames those financial blueprints as maybe just the visible tip of the iceberg, the manifestation of a much deeper, concealed strategic agenda aiming for permanent external control over critical global assets.
A very different way of looking at it.
Okay, to really grasp the depth of the current fears around displacement, especially that 500,000 figure, we need to ground this in history a bit.
Yeah, the sources draw parallels. The plans to relocate 500,000 people inevitably echo earlier, major periods of population upheaval in the region, particularly the events surrounding the 1948 war.
Right, the Nakba?
The disruption back then was a massive historical precursor. The sources note that the conditions of extreme insecurity, the fear, led up to 100,000 Arabs, particularly from the urban upper and middle classes.
From places like Haifa, Jaffa, Jerusalem.
Exactly, those key centers. They evacuated either abroad or to other Arab centers further east. And importantly, these were often the educated, the economically stable classes.
Why did those specific groups tend to evacuate first, and what was the effect?
Well, many upper and middle class Arabs simply had the financial means and the connections to leave quickly, often perhaps expecting to return once the fighting died down.
But they didn't, or couldn't.
And their immediate departure created this leadership vacuum. It significantly disrupted the social and economic fabric of the Arab population that remained right during that critical period. This history serves as a kind of template, the sources suggest, for understanding how conflict-induced instability can facilitate rapid, strategic demographic shifts that can lead to permanent dispossession.
And looking back even further than 1948, the sources also dig into the original geopolitical motives behind other key historical events, suggesting they were often deeply tied to very pragmatic financial and propaganda needs.
Right, not solely ideology. This brings us to the Balfour Declaration in 1917.
Which promised British support for a national home for the Jewish race in Palestine.
Yes. And Prime Minister Lloyd George's own evidence, which is cited in the sources, suggests that the timing of that declaration wasn't accidental. It was explicitly driven by urgent propagandist reasons during a really critical, desperate moment in World War I.
What was the situation?
Desperate, as I said. The Russian army had effectively collapsed, totally demoralized. The French army was reeling, unable to launch offensives. The Italians had just suffered a major, crushing defeat. Britain desperately needed something, some new edge.
So what was the deal? What was the transaction, according to these sources?
It's presented as a very high-stakes deal with significant financial leverage. Zionist leaders reportedly gave a definite promise.
A promise that if the Allies publicly committed to establishing a Jewish national home in Palestine,
They, the Zionists, would do their best to rally Jewish sentiment and support throughout the world to the Allied cause.
okay, rallying sentiment is one thing, but wasn't there more?
Crucially, yes. They believed this commitment would also secure the aid of Jewish financial interests. And this financial aid was seen as uniquely valuable right at that specific moment. Why? Because the Allies had practically exhausted their gold reserves needed for vital purchases from America.
Wow. So the sources explicitly call this making a contract with Jewry.
That's the phrase used in the analysis of Lloyd George's reasoning, yes. It paints a very cold, transactional picture. A wartime necessity driven by the need for financial liquidity, layered over what's often presented as a purely ideological or, romantic commitment to nation building.
It definitely provides a different lens. That major geopolitical shifts often hide these powerful, immediate financial calculations.
Just like, perhaps, the $324 billion asset valuation of the Gaza coastline is viewed today within these documents. History echoing, maybe?
Okay, finally, we need to briefly touch on another layer of motivation discussed in the sources, the more extreme religious geopolitical visions. These also relate to long-term strategic and military agendas, particularly coming from some Western evangelical contexts.
Right. We're talking here about premillennial dispensationalism. It's a theological movement popularized way back in the 19th century by John Nelson Darby, and then really cemented by the Scofield Reference Bible.
And the core idea is interpreting biblical prophecy very literally to understand current geopolitical events, especially those surrounding Israel.
Exactly. And a key element is their interpretation of a specific Hebrew phrase, Nesi Rosh, found in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 38.
Which the King James Bible traditionally translates as chief prince.
Yes, but this movement interprets Nesi Rosh not as chief prince, but as prince of Rosh. And they then connect Rosh definitively to modern-day Russia. They also point to the geography, noting Russia is clearly north of Palestine, matching the text's description.
Okay, so that interpretation creates a kind of literal, predetermined military script based on prophecy.
Precisely. This specific geopolitical vision anticipates a coming World War III. In this scenario, a coalition often interpreted as Russia, Rosh, maybe Germany, Gomer, and the broader Muslim world attacks Israel.
And what's the prophesied outcome they see or perhaps desire?
The sources describe the anticipated prophesied outcome of this great conflict, the destruction of the Muslim holy sites on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, specifically the dome of the Rock Mosque, because its destruction would then allow, in their view, for the Jewish temple to be rebuilt on that site. This rebuilding fulfills key biblical prophecies and sets the stage for the second coming of Christ.
It's a very specific and obviously highly controversial end-time scenario. And what role does this vision assign to international bodies, like the UN?
They're generally viewed very negatively. The UN, in this framework, is often seen as an agent of Satan, actively trying to restrain America's necessary military power.
Weakening America just when its power is supposedly needed for this ultimate battle.
Exactly. Weakening America when it's needed to oppose these prophesied forces in the final showdown between good and evil. So this specific, quite powerful religious strategic framework, while certainly extreme, shows another deep, long-term, non-corporate motivation that, according to the sources, might underlie some Western military support agendas. It ties modern geopolitics directly back to ancient prophecy.
Okay, Let's try and synthesize all of this. It's been an incredibly dense deep dive, hasn't it? Through multiple overlapping layers, explicit financial plans, historical context, and these deep structural theories of global power and even prophecy.
Yeah, and what really stands out is how these different layers seem to converge in the source material. We established that calculated valuation, that stunning $324 billion figure, painting Gaza as this prime coastal asset just waiting for investment.
Then we saw how this financial prize is immediately coupled with governance models, the 50-year foreign lease, the exclusion of local institutions that systematically deny local control.
Which fits the classic profile as described in the analysis of disaster capitalism, built potentially on historical precedents of displacement, like 1948.
And then layered on top, or perhaps underneath, we have these highly suspicious documents suggesting this entire sequence might be influenced or even steered by elite power structures, the Committee of 300, the RIA network.
Seeking not just regional wealth, but maybe global structural control, and allegedly using sophisticated social engineering psychological tools to manage public reaction and consent along the way.
The sources really compel you to see those glossy financial plans, not just as business proposals, but potentially as instruments for a much larger, perhaps oligarchic strategic endgame.
So when you, our listener, encounter news about reconstruction in Gaza or aid packages or military agendas in the Middle East, these sources challenge you. They challenge you to look beyond the immediate conflict headlines.
To look towards these deep, long-term corporate and strategic motivations, whether they're transparent or hidden.
To shift focus towards the sheer scale of the proposed investments, the ports, the luxury hotels, the high-tech hubs, and to recognize, based on these documents, that these plans seem to require external control and permanent population resettlement enforced by outside security to succeed.
So what does this all mean for you, trying to navigate this incredibly complex world? The sources are essentially saying that the pursuit of this potential $324 billion asset appears predicated on a population needing to be moved and a local government effectively neutralized for half a century.
And then there's that final unsettling point from the suspicious documents. The idea that public opinion itself is frequently manufactured, engineered to govern our reactions to crises they might even create.
Whether by promoting amusement focus to distract us, or through orchestrated news narratives directed by powerful, unseen interests.
It raises a really fundamental question, doesn't it? If the world is being steered, even partially, by powerful, invisible hands, military, corporate, oligarchic, whatever they might be, and if these forces rely on confusion and distraction.
How can any of us accurately figure out what's really going on? How can we discern an adaptive response? Where does genuine, unprofiled information even exist outside of these potentially predetermined narratives?
That, perhaps, is the ultimate knowledge that this deep dive, based on these challenging sources, compels you to seek out and explore further for yourself.